Enforcing the United Nations Charter, that's the key to world peace and prosperity. Hello, my name is Edward Sonino. Coming out of the horrors of World War II and the Holocaust, the Charter of the United Nations was signed on June 26, 1945 in San Francisco and came into force on October 24, 1945. It is extremely important that all citizens of UN member nations be very familiar with the Charter of the United Nations, just as they should be very familiar with the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It is the only way to ensure that governments respect and uphold both charters. The reason the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration have been violated so many times by so many member nations is that 99.9% of their citizens are not at all familiar with either the UN Charter or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There is therefore little or no public pressure on governments to follow the provisions of both the UN Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. However, it should be pointed out that all member states of the United Nations have the duty to publicize both charters and to educate their citizens so that the citizens have a strong grasp of the UN Charter, which lists the obligations of all UN member nations, and of the Universal Declaration, which lists the various human rights of individuals which must be upheld. Unfortunately, and scandalously, not one member nation has fulfilled that duty, not even the few ones generally respecting both charters. It is extremely urgent for the United Nations to finally discipline all its members and make them fulfill their duty to publicize both charters and to educate all their citizens on both charters. That is essential in order to win the war of ideas and put an end to human rights violations, to Islamic terrorism, to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to violations of international law, and to military conflicts between nations in general. Quotes from the magnificent, inspiring, and moving introductory resolution and from Article 1 and Article 2 of the Charter will be followed by relevant comments. I quote, "We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small, and to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom, and for these ends to practice tolerance and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors, and to unite our strength to maintain international peace and security, and to ensure by the acceptance of principles and the institution of methods that armed force shall not be used, save in the common interest, and to employ international machinery for the promotion of the economic and social advancement of all peoples, have resolved to combine our efforts to accomplish these aims. Accordingly, our respective governments, through representatives assembled in the city of San Francisco, who have exhibited their full powers found to be in good and due form, have agreed to the present Charter of the United Nations and do hereby establish an international organization to be known as the United Nations. Here now is Article 1. The purposes of the United Nations are 1. To maintain international peace and security, and to that end, to take effective collective measures for the prevention and removal of threats to the peace, and for the suppression of acts of aggression or other breaches of the peace, and to bring about by peaceful means and in conformity with the principles of justice and international law, adjustment or settlement of international disputes or situations which might lead to a breach of the peace. 2. To develop friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, and to take other appropriate measures to strengthen universal peace. 3. To achieve international cooperation in solving problems of an economic, social, cultural, or humanitarian character, and in promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all, without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. And 4, to be a center for harmonizing the actions of nations in the attainment of these common ends. Here now is Article 2. The organization and its members, in pursuit of the purposes stated in Article 1, shall act in accordance with the following principles. 1. The organization is based on the principle of the sovereign equality of all its members. 2. All members, in order to ensure to all of them the rights and benefits resulting from membership, shall fulfill in good faith the obligations assumed by them in accordance with the present Charter. 3. All members shall settle their international disputes by peaceful means in such a manner that international peace and security and justice are not endangered. 4. All members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. 5. All members shall give the United Nations every assistance in any action it takes in accordance with the present Charter, and shall refrain from giving assistance to any state against which the United Nations is taking preventive or enforcement action. 6. The organization shall ensure that states which are not members of the United Nations act in accordance with these principles so far as may be necessary for the maintenance of international peace and security. End quote. Having read the introductory resolution and the first 2 articles of the UN Charter, anyone paying attention to the political developments around the world will immediately be struck by the fact that there have been innumerable violations of human rights by member nations, including by some in the Security Council, and by the fact that there have been numerous violations by member nations, including by some in the Security Council, of other nations' sovereignty through military and other destructive actions. That even member nations in the Security Council, nations with the highest duty to respect and uphold the United Nations principles, would violate those principles is shockingly hypocritical and dismaying. Even more dismaying is the fact that the UN itself is not loudly criticizing the violations of human rights and the violations of other nations' sovereignty, and that no violating member nations are being censured or being penalized for their infractions. At the very least, member nations who violate the Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights should lose their voting rights, and, if they do not promptly demonstrate remorse and rectify their mistakes by compensating their victims, whether nations or individuals, they should be expelled from the United Nations. Otherwise, the credibility of the UN becomes severely compromised as the United Nations ends up betraying its ideals and serving no purpose. Worse, by betraying its own principles through inaction, it ends up undermining those very principles in the minds of many. The Charter's introductory resolution and its first 2 articles are so eloquent in defense of high morality regarding human rights and relations between nations that it is hard to imagine that any human being or any government would violate the UN's principles after having read them and having pledged to uphold them. Had the Charter's principle of self-determination of peoples been kept in mind and respected, the former Yugoslavia would have split up peacefully into different sovereign nations through popular referendums under the aegis of the United Nations, instead of through military conflict with thousands of casualties and many atrocities. The same goes for Crimea and southeastern Ukraine, which could have petitioned the United Nations to organize and conduct a referendum on secession from Ukraine, thereby avoiding a military conflict with thousands of casualties. Had the leaders of the Soviet Union kept in mind the UN Charter, which their nation had signed and pledged to uphold, they most probably would not have sent their tanks into Hungary in 1956 to repress a popular revolt against a pro-Soviet dictatorial regime which violated human rights. The same goes for the Soviet Union sending tanks into Czechoslovakia in 1968 to remove a liberalizing government which reflected the popular will and replace it with a pro-Soviet hardline regime violating human rights. Had the United States kept in mind the Charter, it would probably not have backed the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba to remove the Castro regime by military means, a violation of Cuba's sovereignty, regardless of whether the Castro regime imposed communism and violated human rights. Similarly, had the United States and France kept the Charter in mind, they would not have intervened militarily in Libya's civil war with catastrophic results for the Libyan people. The same goes for Syria's civil war, where military intervention by Iran, Russia, Lebanon's Hezbollah, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and the United States has resulted in a catastrophe of incredible proportions for the Syrian people. The serious violations of human rights by the Gaddafi and Assad regimes should have been handled a long time ago by the United Nations through loud public condemnation, revoking their UN voting rights, and finally through expulsion in case of continued violations. Incredibly, the United Nations allowed Libya to head its Human Rights Commission, the height of hypocrisy and a devastating affront to human rights. For world peace and economic and social prosperity, the United Nations must finally fulfill its invaluable mission and its great promise. Apart from enforcing its principles unwaveringly, so that its member nations respect and enforce them, it must raise the profile of its Charter and of its Universal Declaration of Human Rights throughout the world, through a major public relations and education effort. The first step would be to have all member nations include a course on the United Nations Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, along with the history of their violations, in the curriculum of their high schools and in their high school graduation exams. The second step would be to schedule a special world televised United Nations meeting with President Putin, President Obama, and President Xi Jinping, side by side, taking turns reading out loud the Charter's resolution and its first two articles, followed by a reading of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then shake hands while promising the world that they will cooperate to uphold the UN's principles and to have all member nations do the same. The third step would be having the political leaders of the Israelis and the Palestinians, including those of Hamas, stand side by side and do the same, publicly acknowledging that their conflict is essentially not about land, but about religious discrimination, which they vow to end by having their governments and citizens truly believe in and strictly adhere to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. They would make the obvious point that were the Israelis and the Palestinians all of the same religion, or were all atheists, there would never have been a conflict between them. Proof that their conflict is essentially about religious discrimination, not about land. The fourth step should be establishing an annual United Nations Day, with alternating leaders of the Security Council reading out loud the Charter's resolution and its first two articles, along with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to be broadcast and streamed to all nations and shown in all high schools worldwide. Government leaders of all member nations should be required to do the same in their own countries once a year. Another important policy would be to require all new national presidents and prime ministers of member nations to promptly go on TV and radio in prime time and personally pledge to uphold the UN Charter and the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and then read aloud the Charter's resolution and Articles 1 and 2, as well as the entire Declaration of Human Rights. One cannot overstate the importance of publicizing and teaching the United Nations Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights worldwide. That is the key to world peace and prosperity. No exaggeration. Thanks for your attention.